Blessed love, and welcome to another edition of Things You Will Ignore in U.S. History with Coach Pete. Today we're going to be talking about Module 8, the Roaring Twenties. Part 1, the Business of America. Struggles for Peace. Now, as we learned during our 28th President, GQVL, dealing with Woodrow Wilson's administration, during that time, the United States was not unlike many of the European countries to where they become wearisome of the war. People were tired. And so the candidacy of Warren G. Harding, his campaign mantra was return to normalcy. When he was elected president, his economic policies were just like his campaign slogan, less government in business and more business in government. However, one of the things that really stands out in the presidency of Warren G. Harding was the Teapot Dome scandal. This is when government oil fields for Navy use were leased out by the Secretary of the Interior, Albert B. Fall. He was later convicted of bribery and became the first American to be convicted of a felony while holding a cabinet post. American industries flourish. Now, one of the reasons why it is called the Roaring Twenties is because these American industries really began to boom and to flourish during this time period. Calvin Coolidge became the 30th President of the United States after Harding suddenly died while in office. His economic policies fit into the pro-business spirit of the 1920s very well. The goal was to keep taxes low and business profits up, which gave businesses more available credit to expand. Also, government involvement in business was minimized to allow private enterprise to flourish. Now, one of these enterprises that flourished was the auto industry. Henry Ford and the Model T revolutionized the workforce with innovations in the assembly line. Notice how assembly line is highlighted. One of the things that the assembly line did was it increased productivity and reduced the cost of production. Now, the automobile itself changed the American landscape by allowing the freedom of people to travel. Now, this freedom to travel was not just afforded to anybody, but if you could afford a car, right, now you can travel from Omaha, Nebraska to Savannah, Georgia, and then you have stories to tell the people back in Omaha about what you saw along the way. True, there was railroads, but this gives people the more autonomous and individual freedom to travel. Houses were changed because of the automobile industry. See, because as people are moving to the suburbs and as these houses are being built, people are owning cars and they need a place to store their cars. Now you have houses that are being built with garages and carports. So the auto industry changes up the way that people live in terms of their housing. And then also roads were paved for driving, right? This is also what we kind of refer to when we talk about the urban sprawl. Another reason why it's called the Roaring Twenties is because America's standards of living began to soar. Now, this idea of consumerism, the acquisition of goods in an ever-increasing amounts, this becomes popular during the 1920s. And it's something that we can kind of relate to now. Like I know when I'm sitting back with my Amazon Prime, it's never enough. As soon as I order one thing on Amazon Prime, it's like next day I'm back ordering something else. In fact, I order so much Amazon Prime, I want Amazon Future. I want Amazon to know like tomorrow exactly what it is I'm going to want and order it for me, and then it already be at my house before I even think about it. Amazon Future. Because consumerism, the acquisition of goods in ever-increasing amounts, all right? Well, how did this begin in the 1920s? Well, electrical conveniences started to become more available. Why? Because the electrification of new areas in the country made it possible for people to use/buy the latest home conveniences of the time period. Irons, refrigerators, cooking ranges, vacuum cleaners, and toasters are just a few of the popular items. This is also when the modern advertising that we think of today, the dawn of modern advertising, came from the 1920s. Here, in the 1920s, advertisers began to hire psychologists to study how to appeal to people's desire for youthfulness, beauty, health, and wealth. Now, I know this is things you will ignore in U.S. history, but I have to say this again, my beloveds. Advertisers began to hire psychologists to study how to appeal to people's desire for youthfulness, beauty, health, and wealth. Now, if we look at any commercial that we may see on our television, if we look at some of the ads that we see as we're on Google or as we're on TikTok or as we're on Facebook, whatever social media platform you're using, right? We see that these advertisements, these ads are appealing to people's desires for youthfulness, because nobody wants to be old, right? Nobody wants to have as many gray hairs and white hairs as I have on top of my head. People look and say, hey, Mr. Peterson, like you look like you're an old sage here teaching, right? Why don't you get some Rogaine for men and dye your hair black? Because we know you're not that old, and I'm not. But I'm also not ashamed to not look as youthful as I once have. See, you have to embrace the days and the minutes that we have in this present time. And people have a desire to appeal back to the past, to be youthful, right? Beauty. Do these ads appeal to our sense of what is beautiful and try to get us to adhere to a model to where beauty is something that is exterior as opposed to something that is interior, something that shines through us? People's desire for health. We have the 100% natural, organic, non-GMO, superfood. All of these labels get put in it's to appeal to our desire to be healthy, right? Because we want to eat well. We want what we intake into our body to be good for us. We have a desire for these things and the desire for wealth. If we look at these advertisements, these commercials, right? They show us a level of wealth that we either are to aspire to, or we look and say, man, I can't afford that and I need to, right? Psychologists began to study how to appeal to people's desires. And so in the 1920s, you have this advertisement model that changes. Brand names also become more familiar from coast to coast, and luxury items now seemed like necessities. Many Americans idealized business people during these prosperous times. A superficial prosperity. The adoption of mass production techniques increased productivity and businesses expanded. In addition to advertising, consumers were lured to purchase more and more goods through credit. The installment plan allowed for people to buy a product over an extended period without having to put much money down, if anything at all. Now, some economists feared that credit, the installment buying, would get out of hand and ruin the economy. However, most Americans continued to engage in the trappings of consumerism. Part 2. Post-war issues. Post-war trends. Post-war fears. After the war, xenophobia, unreasoned fear of things or people seen as foreign or strange, nativism, prejudice against foreign-born people, and isolationism, a policy of pulling away from involvement in world affairs, became prevalent throughout American society. However, the American economy was becoming more international. Communism, an economic and political system based on a single-party government ruled by a dictatorship, became a perceived prominent fear to the American way of life. The FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, and A. Mitchell Palmer raided groups who were either supporters of communism or anarchists. The case of Sacco and Vanzetti is one of the most famous incidents of the Red Scare. The Ku Klux Klan, or KKK, was a group that capitalized on the Red Scare. Going back to Woodrow Wilson's administration and his policies, the Klan saw its membership rise to about 4.5 million white males. Woodrow Wilson's administration hosted a showing of the racist movie, A Birth of a Nation. African Americans, Roman Catholics, Jews, and foreign-born people were the targets of their hatred and rhetoric. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 set up a quota system which established the maximum number of people who could enter the United States from each foreign country. The goal was to drastically decrease European immigration in the United States, which it did. A time of labor unrest. Labor strikes increased as employees demanded better working conditions. John L. Lewis became a national hero after his leadership in the coal miners' strike. This was during President Wilson's presidency. However, in the 1920s, labor movements lost steam. There were 5 major reasons why. 1. Restrictive government policies intimidated union advocates. 2. Much of the workforce consisted of immigrants who were willing to work in poor conditions. 3. The different languages spoken by immigrants created an obstacle for organization or unification. 4. Farmers who came to the cities in search of factories' jobs relied on themselves. And 5. Most unions excluded African Americans. Part 3. Changing Ways of Life. Rural and urban differences. The conservative morals and close relationships that were characteristic of small towns were abandoned in favor of the opportunities that city life could provide. However, small town migrants began to bring their rural attitudes to the city, which conflicted with the modern urban lifestyle. The 18th Amendment, which prohibited the manufacturing, sale, or transportation of alcoholic beverages, went into effect in January of 1920. Reformers had long considered liquor a prime cause for corruption. They believed too much drinking led to crime, wife and child abuse, accidents on the job, and other social problems. To avoid the law, drinkers went underground to hidden saloons and nightclubs known as speakeasies because everyone spoke quietly or easy to avoid detection. People bought alcohol from bootleggers who smuggled alcohol from Canada, Cuba, and the West Indies. One of the cobra effects of prohibition was organized crime. Some people developed a disrespect for the law, and organized crime capitalized on the bootlegging industry. Al Capone of Chicago was a gangster who became a legend during the time of Prohibition. Science and religion clash. The Protestant Christian movement, grounded in a literal or non-symbolic interpretation of the Bible, was known as fundamentalism. They were skeptical of some scientific discoveries and theories, arguing that all important knowledge could be found in the Bible. In March of 1925, Tennessee passed the nation's first law that made it a crime to teach evolution. John T. Scopes, a biology teacher from Dayton, was arrested for teaching evolution. Scopes was eventually found guilty and fined $100. To this day, evolution remains controversial in some communities. Part 4. The Twenties Woman. Young women change the rules. A flapper was a liberated young woman who embraced the new fashions and urban attitude of the day. During this time, young women became more assertive. In the 1920s, casual dating became more increasingly accepted. Still, a double standard, which is a set of principles granting men more sexual freedom than women, existed. New opportunities at work helped to change the family dynamic. Also, technological advancements simplified household labor and family life. This allowed many middle-class homemakers to focus more on their time on their homes, children, and pastimes. Adolescent rebellion over parental control increased, much like how the flappers resisted societal control. Education and popular culture. School and the mass media shape culture. Until the 1920s, high schools catered to college-bound students. Vocational training and other courses were added during this era. In the 1920s, widespread education increased literacy in America, but the growing mass media shaped a mass culture. Newspaper writers and editors imitated the sensational style of the tabloids to hook readers. Radio was the most powerful communications medium to emerge in the 1920s. This allowed for the nation to have a shared experience of hearing the news as it happened. Popular culture reflects new attitudes. The leisure culture that developed during the 1920s stimulated the arts. Movies became a national pastime, offering viewers a means of escape. This helps to bring popular culture to eager customers. Writers and composers broke away from European traditions, as did painters who rejected traditional art as outdated, creating what is called modernism. Part 6. The Harlem Renaissance. African American voices in the 1920s. During the 1920s, African Americans set new goals for themselves as they left the Jim Crow South. The phrase, "black is beautiful," was used at this time, and it reflected their changing attitudes of themselves. The NAACP urged African Americans to protest racial violence. W.E.B. Du Bois led a protest that failed to convince President Wilson to improve protections. Under the leadership of James Weldon Johnson, the NAACP made anti-lynching laws a major priority, continuing its campaign through anti-lynching organizations that had been established in 1892 by Ida B. Wells. African American voices in the 1920s. Marcus Garvey, an immigrant from Jamaica, believed that African Americans should build a separate society. He founded the UNIA in 1914 and moved it to New York City in 1918. Garvey encouraged his followers to return to Africa to throw off the chains of colonial oppression. He also advocated for black nationalism, the notion that all black people are one and should put aside their differences and unite. Here on this side, we have highlighted Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, two different thoughts or schools of thought of how to obtain rights for black people. We could also include in the previous slide Marcus Garvey and the Back to Africa movement and black nationalism. However, for the time being, let's just focus on these two, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Oftentimes, the conversation pits them against one another. However, instead of us getting trapped by level 2 thinking, let's move beyond that and see the coexisting forces, how both of them worked together to obtain rights for Negroes, for black people, for African Americans, whereas Booker T. Washington believed in a gradual equality, and it would be through vocational training, through the economic side, right? W.E.B. Du Bois believed that it should be more immediate in the equality for African Americans, for black people, that it was wrong for Negroes to expect an earning of their equality. And also, it should be the major focus, education, right? Both of them still, beyond the differences, believed in rights for African Americans. So once again, let's not get caught into the level 2 thinking of the conversation. As far as the verses is concerned, let's flip the script and take a look at the coexisting forces and how these two schools of thought, along with Marcus Garvey, those three, all were about unified in wanting to obtain rights for Negroes, for African Americans, for black people. The Harlem Renaissance flowers in New York. The Harlem Renaissance was a literary and artistic movement that celebrated African American culture. Alan Locke, Claude McKay, Zora Neale Hurston, and Langston Hughes are just a few of the famous writers of the time. Jazz musicians such as Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington were prominent during this era, as well as singers like Josephine Baker and Bessie Smith. The Harlem Renaissance was characterized by economic prosperity, new ideas, changing values, and personal freedom. Most of the social changes were enduring. However, the economic boom was short-lived. We've come to a conclusion of Module 8, The Roaring Twenties. Thank you for tuning in to another edition of Things You Will Ignore in U.S. History. Blessed love.